Mistress slaps pregnant black ex-wife in court. Cold, wealthy CEO doesn't know judge is her father. That's when it happened. Keisha stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. Every eye in the room focused on her as she walked toward the front of the courtroom. Have you ever had a parent who tried to warn you about someone, but you didn't listen? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. The courtroom erupted in gasps as the sound of palm meeting cheek echoed through Atlanta's most prestigious courthouse. 7 months pregnant and glowing, Keisha Monroe stood frozen as her ex-husband's new woman pulled her hand back with a satisfied smirk. Have you ever been publicly humiliated by someone who should have protected you? Have you watched your ex choose their new lover over basic human decency? The cameras caught everything. Designer heels clicking against marble floors. Expensive watches ticking in the silence. And somewhere in the back, a phone recording what would become the most viral courtroom moment of the decade. This is what happens when wealth meets wickedness, when power thinks it can crush dignity. But what they didn't know was that justice was about to wear the face of someone they never expected. Richard Langston sat stone-faced beside Vanessa, his mistress-turned-fiancée, dressed like she owned the world. His tailored suit cost more than most people's cars. His cold eyes never left his phone screen, scrolling through stock prices while his pregnant ex-wife trembled 3 feet away. The fluorescent lights cast long shadows across the mahogany courtroom as Atlanta's elite watched what they thought would be a simple custody case. You could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. Keisha's hand moved protectively over her swollen belly. Her thrift store blazer couldn't hide her strength, the fire in her eyes that said she wasn't backing down. Not today. Not anymore. Your Honor, Vanessa's lawyer began, his voice dripping with false sincerity. My client has concerns about Ms. Monroe's ability to... Ability? Keisha's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. You want to talk about ability? Let's talk about the ability to abandon a pregnant woman. The ability to choose money over morals. Richard finally looked up from his phone. For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Guilt? Regret? It disappeared as quickly as it came. Drop a comment if you've ever felt completely alone in a room full of people. The judge, a stern, gray-haired man from Montgomery, Alabama, watched every exchange with unreadable eyes. His weathered hands gripped the gavel like he was holding back something bigger than legal proceedings. Vanessa leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the table. She's desperate, she whispered, loud enough for the microphones to catch. Look at her, living off food stamps while trying to trap a billionaire. That's when it happened. Keisha stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. Every eye in the room focused on her as she walked toward the front of the courtroom. Tell me what you'd do if your child's father abandoned you, she said, looking directly at the gallery of reporters and onlookers. Tell me what you'd do if the man who promised to love you forever chose someone who sees you as a threat to eliminate. The courtroom held its breath. Richard's lawyer shuffled papers nervously. This wasn't going according to plan. They'd expected a quiet settlement, maybe some tears, definitely defeat. They hadn't expected this, a woman who refused to be broken. Vanessa's face twisted with rage. She jumped up, pointing a manicured finger at Keisha. You think you can waltz in here with your sob story and take what's mine? What's yours? Keisha's voice was steady, powerful. You mean the man who threw away his family for a corporate climber? Keep him. That's when Vanessa lost control. She crossed the aisle in 3 quick steps, her hand connecting with Keisha's cheek in a sound that silenced the room. The judge's gavel slammed down once, twice. The sound echoed like gunshots. Richard didn't move, didn't defend her, didn't even flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair with something that looked almost like a smile. His wealth and lawyers would crush her like always. Or so he thought. But Keisha stood firm, one hand on her cheek, the other protecting her unborn child. She looked directly into the judge's eyes that held secrets no one in that room could imagine. The bailiff moved toward Vanessa, but the judge held up a hand. Ms. Vanessa, return to your seat. Immediately. Vanessa strutted back, confidence oozing from every step. She made her point. She'd shown everyone who held the power in this room. Or so she thought. The judge's voice filled the courtroom, deep and commanding. I want to see all parties in my chambers. Now, Richard's lawyer whispered something urgent in his ear. Richard shrugged it off. He'd been in judges' chambers before. Money talked. Money always talked. What would you have done if you were Keisha in that moment? Tell me below. As they filed toward the back of the courtroom, Keisha felt her baby kick hard against her ribs. Almost like the child knew something big was about to happen. Something that would change everything. The heavy wooden door to the judge's chambers closed with a final click. The reporters pressed against the windows, trying to catch any glimpse of what would happen next. Because as the judge's gavel slammed down, calling for order, Keisha looked directly into his eyes for the first time in 8 years. What she saw there made her blood run cold and changed everything. The man behind the bench wasn't just any judge. He was Judge Samuel Monroe, her father, the man she hadn't spoken to since her wedding day, when he tried to warn her about Richard. The man she'd shut out of her life because she thought she knew better. And now, he held Richard Langston's fate in his hands. The most powerful person in that courtroom wasn't the tech billionaire or his expensive lawyer. It was the man whose daughter he destroyed. Picture this. Judge Samuel Monroe had presided over hundreds of cases, his weathered hands steady on the gavel, his voice commanding respect across 3 decades. But sitting behind that bench, watching his only daughter's tears fall on her swollen belly while her ex-husband smirked, something inside this veteran officer of justice began to crack. Had you ever had a parent who tried to warn you about someone, but you didn't listen? Share your story. 8 years ago, Samuel Monroe had walked his daughter down the aisle with a heavy heart. He'd seen through Richard's charm, recognized the cold calculation behind those expensive smiles. But Keisha was in love and young, and convinced her father was just being overprotective. "Daddy, you don't know him like I do," she'd said, adjusting her veil in the church mirror. "He makes me feel special. He sees something in me that nobody else does." What Samuel saw was a predator who'd found easy prey. But how do you tell your daughter that the man she's about to marry looks at her like a business acquisition? The wedding reception was a showcase of wealth and power. Richard's friend from the tech world, his business partners, his family's old money connections. Keisha looked beautiful, but small among them, like a wildflower in a field of artificial roses. Samuel tried one last time during their father-daughter dance. "Baby girl, it's not too late to change your mind. Marriage should be about partnership, not rescue." Keisha pulled away from him, her eyes flashing with hurt and anger. "I thought you'd be happy for me. I thought you'd want me to have a better life." "I want you to have the life you deserve," Samuel whispered, but the music was too loud, and she was already turning away. That was the last real conversation they'd had. What would you do if you had to choose between professional duty and family loyalty? Now, years later, Richard sat across from him in chambers, drumming his fingers against the leather chair like he owned the place. His lawyer, some hotshot from the biggest firm in Atlanta, spread documents across Samuel's desk with practiced efficiency. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, "my client is prepared to offer a very reasonable settlement. Ms. Monroe would receive monthly support payments, and we're willing to discuss limited visitation." Limited visitation? Samuel's voice cut through the legal jargon like steel. For his own child? Richard finally looked up, meeting the judge's eyes directly. There was no recognition there, no memory of the man who had walked his ex-wife down the aisle. To Richard, Samuel was just another judge to charm or intimidate. "Your Honor, we need to consider what's best for the child. Keisha's living situation is unstable. She's working 3 jobs, living in a 1-bedroom apartment. My fiancé and I can provide opportunities." "Your fiancé?" Samuel's fingers tightened around his pen. "The woman who just assaulted a pregnant woman in my courtroom." The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, emotions are running high. Ms. Vanessa was defending herself against verbal attacks." Defending herself? Samuel stood up, his full height imposing in the small chamber. "I saw what happened. We all saw what happened." Through the chamber's window, Samuel could see Keisha sitting alone on the courthouse bench, her hand moving in slow circles over her belly. She looked exactly like she had at 16, the night she called him crying because her boyfriend had stood her up for prom. He'd driven 40 minutes in a thunderstorm to pick her up, still in his work clothes, and taken her to get ice cream instead. "Boys who don't see your worth don't deserve your tears," he'd told her. Now she was 28, pregnant, and facing down the same kind of man who thought her worth was negotiable. Richard leaned forward, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a reasonable tone. "Look, Judge, I'm not trying to hurt anyone here, but let's be realistic. Keisha made her choices. She left me. She's been living like this for months without saying a word about any baby. Now, suddenly she wants support? It seems convenient." Samuel's jaw tightened. Every instinct screamed at him to tell this man exactly who he was dealing with. But judicial ethics held him back, barely. "Mr. Langston, are you questioning the paternity of the child?" "I'm questioning her motives," Richard replied smoothly. "My company has been in the news lately. Successful merger, stock prices up. Suddenly my ex-wife appears with claims about a child I've never heard of." That's when Samuel understood exactly what kind of man his daughter had married. The kind who saw conspiracy in desperation, who saw manipulation in a mother trying to provide for her child. The kind of man who needed to be taught a lesson about real power. "Gentlemen, I'm calling a recess." Samuel's voice carried the weight of 30 years on the bench. "We'll reconvene in 1 hour." Richard's lawyer gathered his papers, confident they'd made their case. Richard stood to leave, already reaching for his phone. "Mr. Langston." Samuel's voice stopped him at the door. "1 hour. Don't be late." As the door closed behind them, Samuel sat alone in his chambers, staring at a framed photo on his desk. Keisha at her law school graduation, before she'd met Richard, when her eyes still held dreams instead of survival. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a thick file. Corporate fraud investigations. Excessive violation. Employment lawsuits settled out of court. Richard Langston's empire wasn't as clean as his expensive suit suggested. When court reconvened, Judge Monroe's first words weren't about custody or support. They were 5 words that made Richard's lawyer go pale. "I'm calling a private recess." Because Samuel Monroe had spent 8 years regretting that he hadn't protected his daughter the first time. He wouldn't make that mistake again. What happens in judicial chambers can destroy empires, and Richard Langston was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The mahogany doors of Judge Monroe's chambers closed with a final click, shutting out the buzz of reporters and curious onlookers. The room felt smaller now, intimate in a way that made Richard's confidence waver for the first time all day. Samuel Monroe moved behind his desk like a man who'd made a decision. His gray eyes, the same eyes Keisha had inherited, fixed on Richard with an intensity that made the tech billionaire shift in his leather chair. "Before we continue," Samuel said, his voice carrying decades of courtroom authority, "there's something you need to know." Richard's lawyer sensed trouble brewing. "Your Honor, if there's any conflict of interest, Keisha Monroe is my daughter." The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that would change everything. Richard's face went white. His lawyer's pen clattered to the floor. Outside, they could hear Vanessa's sharp voice demanding to know what was taking so long. "Your daughter?" Richard's voice came out as barely a whisper. Samuel nodded slowly. "The woman you married 8 years ago. The woman you abandoned while she was carrying your child. The woman your fiancé just assaulted in my courtroom." Each word was measured, controlled, but carrying enough force to level buildings. Richard's mind raced backward, trying to remember details he'd never bothered to learn. Keisha's family, her background, her father who couldn't make it to their wedding because of some court case. "The case was here," Samuel continued, reading his thoughts. "Child custody dispute. I chose my professional duty over walking my daughter down the aisle. Biggest regret of my life." His voice dropped lower. "Until today. Have you ever realized you completely underestimated someone? Tell me about the moment everything changed." Richard's lawyer was frantically flipping through legal codes, trying to find grounds for recusal, postponement, anything to get them out of this room. Your Honor, this creates an obvious bias. We'll need to request a different judge. Mr. Peterson, Samuel's voice cut through the panic. Sit down. The lawyer sat. Samuel opened a thick file on his desk. Pages of documents that made Richard's stomach drop. Bank records, corporate filings, investigation reports. You see, Mr. Langston, when my daughter disappeared from your life, I did what any father would do. I started paying attention to the man who hurt her. Richard stared at the documents like they were snakes ready to strike. You can't use personal information in a legal proceeding. Personal information? Samuel's eyebrows rose. These are public records. Essuie filing, employment lawsuits, tax documents. He spread them across the desk like playing cards. Amazing what you can find when you know where to look. The room felt like it was shrinking. Richard loosened his tie, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The employee pension fund that mysteriously lost 30% of its value right before your last merger. The sexual harassment settlements your company has paid out in the past 2 years. Each revelation hit like a physical blow. Richard's empire, built on carefully hidden secrets, was crumbling in real time. And then there's Vanessa. Samuel pulled out another set of documents. 3 previous arrests, 2 restraining orders from former employers, a history of targeting wealthy men going through divorces. Richard's world tilted sideways. That's impossible. She's never told you the truth about anything, Samuel finished. Jennifer Vasquez from Miami. Rebecca Valdez from Dallas. Victoria Vance from Houston. She's been Vanessa for exactly 18 months, right around the time she applied for a job at your company. The door to chambers burst open. Vanessa stood there, her perfect composure cracking around the edges. What's taking so long? Our lawyer said. She stopped mid-sentence, seeing the documents spread across Samuel's desk. The color drained from her face. Ms. Vanessa, Samuel said calmly. Or should I say, Ms. Vasquez? That's when everything fell apart. Vanessa's mask slipped completely. The sophisticated executive assistant disappeared, replaced by someone desperate and cornered. You can't prove anything, she hissed, but her voice shook. Actually, Samuel replied, pressing a button on his desk phone. I can. The bailiff appeared in the doorway instantly, like he'd been waiting for this moment. Ms. Vasquez, you're under arrest for perjury, fraud, and assault. What would you do if you watched your entire life collapse in 30 minutes? Comment below. Richard sat frozen as chaos erupted around him. Vanessa screaming denials. His lawyer desperately trying to distance his client from the unfolding disaster. The bailiff reading rights with practiced calm. But Samuel Monroe's eyes never left Richard's face. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. It was about a father who'd failed to protect his daughter once and refused to fail her again. Mr. Langston, Samuel said as the noise died down, you have a choice to make. You can continue fighting this battle you've already lost, or you can start thinking about what kind of father you want to be. Richard stared at the wreckage of his carefully constructed life. Everything he'd built, everything he'd accumulated, meant nothing in this room. As Vanessa was led away in handcuffs, she screamed one final accusation that made everyone freeze, especially Keisha, who was standing in the doorway. That baby isn't even his. The silence that followed was deafening. Every empire built on lies eventually crumbles. Richard's was about to become rubble. The courthouse erupted in chaos as Vanessa's final words echoed through the marble hallways. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Camera flashes exploded like lightning. And in the center of it all, Keisha stood perfectly still, her hand protective over her belly, watching the woman who tried to destroy her being led away in handcuffs. That baby isn't even his. Vanessa screamed again, fighting against the bailiff's grip. Ask her about Houston. Ask her about the conference. Richard's face went from pale to gray. For 8 months, he convinced himself he was the victim. The successful businessman trapped by a desperate ex-wife. But doubt crept in like poison. Have you ever had someone plant a seed of suspicion that grew into something that consumed you? Share your experience. Judge Samuel Monroe's voice cut through the noise like a sword. "Everyone out. Now, except my daughter." The courtroom cleared slowly, reporters being ushered out by security, lawyers gathering their scattered papers. Richard hesitated at the door, looking back at Keisha with questions he was afraid to ask. "Mr. Langston," Samuel said firmly, "you'll have your answers. But not like this." When the door closed, father and daughter stood alone for the first time in 8 years. The weight of their shared history filled the space between them. "Daddy," Keisha whispered, and suddenly she was 16 again, needing her father to make everything okay. Samuel moved around his desk, his judicial robes rustling, and wrapped his arms around his pregnant daughter. "I'm sorry, baby girl. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I let pride keep us apart." Keisha melted into his embrace, 8 years of hurt and stubbornness dissolving in an instant. "I should have listened to you. You saw right through him." "You were in love," Samuel said gently. "Love makes us blind to red flags we'd spot from miles away otherwise." They held each other as chaos continued outside, reporters shouting questions, Vanessa's voice growing fainter as she was taken to booking, Richard's lawyer making frantic phone calls. "Is it true?" Samuel asked quietly. "About Houston?" Keisha pulled back, meeting her father's eyes with the same steady strength he'd always admired in her. "There was a marketing conference in Houston. 3 days. Richard couldn't come because of some merger deal." Samuel waited, letting her tell the story at her own pace. "I was alone in a city where I grew up, feeling invisible in my marriage, wondering if I'd made a huge mistake." Keisha's voice grew stronger with each word. "There was a man at the conference. Keynote speaker. Kind, funny, actually listened when I talked. The judge and Samuel wanted facts. The father in him wanted to comfort his daughter. We had dinner, talked until 2 in the morning about dreams and disappointments and whether it's possible to love someone who doesn't really see you." Keisha's eyes were clear, honest. "Nothing happened, Daddy. Nothing physical. But for one night, I remembered what it felt like to be valued for my mind instead of just tolerated for my convenience." Samuel nodded slowly. "And Richard found a receipt from the restaurant in my conference folder. Accused me of having an affair. That was the beginning of the end." Keisha's hand moved over her belly. "This baby was conceived 2 weeks after I got back. Our last attempt at saving something that was already dead." Relief flooded Samuel's face. Not just because his grandson was truly his grandson, but because his daughter's integrity remained intact. A knock interrupted them. Richard's lawyer stood in the doorway, his usual confidence replaced by barely controlled panic. "Your Honor, we need to discuss the implications." "The implications," Samuel said coldly, "are that your client built his defense on the word of a woman with multiple false identities and a criminal record. Through the window, they could see news vans arriving. Social media was already exploding with hashtags. Hashtag courtroom slap, hashtag Vanessa exposed, hashtag justice for Keisha. What would you do if your private family drama became public entertainment? Comment below with your thoughts." Richard appeared behind his lawyer, looking like a man who'd aged a decade in one afternoon. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled, his expensive tie loosened. "I need to know," he said, looking directly at Keisha. "Is the baby mine?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had already burned everything down. Keisha stood slowly, her dignity intact despite everything she'd endured. "You want proof? Fine, we'll do a DNA test. But Richard, ask yourself why you're so quick to believe the worst about me when you never once questioned Vanessa's story about her past." Richard flinched like he'd been slapped, because she was right. He'd accepted Vanessa's explanations without question while doubting the woman who'd loved him faithfully for 5 years. Samuel pulled out a manila envelope from his desk drawer. "The DNA test won't be necessary." All eyes turned to him as he opened the envelope, revealing photographs that made Richard's world tilt sideways. Photos of Richard leaving his office building at 11:47 p.m. on the night he claimed to be in emergency merger meetings. Photos of him entering a downtown hotel with his secretary, not Vanessa, but the woman before her. "The night your son was conceived," Samuel said quietly, You were creating your own betrayals. The photographs scattered across the desk like evidence in a murder trial. Richard stared at them, seeing his own hypocrisy reflected back at him in glossy color prints. The manila envelope the bailiff had handed to Richard earlier contained photos he thought he'd buried forever, and Richard's own face in every single one. Because sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes it shows you exactly who you've always been. They say the truth always comes out, but nobody warns you it comes out swinging. The photograph spread across Judge Monroe's desk told a story of deception that went back years, not months. Richard Langston, the man who'd accused his pregnant ex-wife of infidelity, stared at evidence of his own betrayals spanning their entire marriage. Maria Santos, your former secretary. The Marriott downtown, November 15th. Samuel's voice was clinical, professional. The same night you claimed to be in merger meetings. The same night your son was conceived. Richard's hands shook as he picked up the photographs. Clear, undeniable images of him entering the hotel, leaving 3 hours later, straightening his tie like a man who'd just conducted business of the most personal kind. Have you ever been confronted with proof of something you thought you'd hidden forever? Tell me about that moment of reckoning. Keisha stood silent, watching the man she'd once loved dissolve before her eyes. Not with satisfaction, but with something sadder, the death of illusions she'd carried even after their divorce. There are more, Samuel continued, opening another folder. Amanda Price from accounting. The company retreat in Savannah. Jennifer Walsh from legal. The business trip to Charlotte. Each name was a dagger. Each location a betrayal Keisha had never suspected. Richard's lawyer was frantically taking notes, trying to salvage something from the wreckage. Your Honor, my client's personal conduct doesn't impact the custody. Your client's personal conduct, Samuel interrupted, includes abandoning his pregnant wife, questioning the paternity of his child, and allowing his current partner to physically assault the mother of his unborn son in my courtroom. Outside, the media circus was growing. News helicopters circled overhead. Social media exploded with updates every few minutes. Hashtag Richard Langston was trending nationwide, and not in a good way. Keisha's phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, friends, even former colleagues who'd heard the news. She ignored them all, focusing on the life growing inside her, the child who deserved better than this chaos. How long have you known? Richard asked, his voice barely audible. Samuel's eyes never wavered. Since the day you married my daughter. I hired a private investigator because something about you felt wrong. A father's instinct. The room fell silent except for the ticking of Samuel's antique clock. The same clock that had marked time during hundreds of custody cases, divorce proceedings, family disputes. But none as personal as this. Richard slumped in his chair, the weight of his exposed life crushing his usual arrogance. The company, this will destroy everything I've built. Everything you've stolen, Samuel corrected. The pension fund, the falsified merger documents, the SEC violations. Should I continue? What would you do if your entire empire was built on lies and suddenly everyone could see the foundation cracking? Share your thoughts below. Keisha spoke for the first time in 20 minutes, her voice steady and strong. I never wanted to destroy you, Richard. I just wanted you to acknowledge your son. Richard looked at her, really looked, perhaps for the first time since they'd met. She wasn't the desperate woman he'd painted in his mind. She was the same brilliant marketing strategist he'd fallen for, the same woman who'd built presentations that saved his company millions, the same person who'd seen potential in him before success made him cruel. The baby, he whispered. He's really mine? Keisha's hand moved protectively over her belly. He kicks every time he hears loud voices. He settles down when I play classical music. He's doing 8 weeks. And yes, Richard, he's yours. The weight of fatherhood hit Richard like a physical blow. Not the abstract concept he'd been fighting in court, but the reality of a tiny person who would carry his DNA, his name, his mistakes. Samuel pressed a button on his desk phone. Bring in the next piece of evidence. A bailiff entered carrying a laptop, setting it on the desk, and opening it to reveal a video conference call. On the screen appeared a woman in a bright yellow blazer, sitting in what looked like a law office. "Mr. Langston," the woman said, "my name is Patricia Morales, and I represent 3 of your former employees in Houston, Dallas, and Miami." Richard's face went from gray to green. These weren't just random lawsuits. These were the cases he thought his money had buried. Sexual harassment, wrongful termination, and in one case, attempted rape. Patricia continued, "My clients are prepared to testify about a pattern of behavior that spans 7 years." The laptop screen split into 3 sections, showing 3 women Richard had hoped never to see again. Women whose stories he'd silenced with non-disclosure agreements and hefty settlement payments. "Technology is wonderful," Samuel said quietly. "It's amazing how much evidence exists when someone knows where to look." Richard's carefully constructed life wasn't just crumbling. It was being demolished with surgical precision by a father who'd spent 8 years preparing for this moment. His phone rang, then again, then continuously as news of the evidence spread. Stock prices falling, board members calling emergency meetings, advertisers pulling contracts. The empire built on lies was collapsing in real time, broadcast live on social media for the world to see. "Mr. Langston," Samuel said, closing the laptop, "you have 2 choices. You can continue fighting this battle you've already lost, or you can start thinking about redemption." But just as victory seemed certain for Keisha, Vanessa, calling from her holding cell, played her final, desperate card, one that could destroy them all. The courthouse phone rang. Samuel answered with growing concern, his face darkening with each word. When he hung up, his voice was grim. "Vanessa claims she has evidence that will change everything. Because sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones wrapped in just enough truth to be believable. Some people break under pressure, others become diamonds." The phone call from the county jail lasted exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds, but it changed everything. Vanessa's voice crackled through the courthouse speaker system, desperate and venomous. "I have video recordings," she announced to the stunned courtroom. "Private conversations. Richard and me planning how to handle the Keisha situation. You want to talk about conspiracy? I've got hours of it." Judge Samuel Monroe's jaw tightened. 8 years of careful planning, mountains of evidence, the perfect moment for justice. And now this woman was threatening to drag everyone down with her. Have you ever watched someone try to burn down the entire world just because their own life was ending? Comment below about the most desperate thing you've witnessed. Richard's face went white as fresh paint. "She's lying. There are no recordings." August 15th, your penthouse. Vanessa's voice cut through his denial. "You said, and I quote, 'We need to make sure she can't touch what's mine. Find something to destroy her credibility.'" The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Reporters scribbled frantically. Social media exploded with new hashtags. Hashtag Vanessa tapes, hashtag courtroom bombshell, hashtag Richard exposed. Keisha stood perfectly still, one hand on her belly where her son kicked restlessly. She'd spent months preparing for this battle, but she hadn't prepared for nuclear war. September 3rd, Vanessa continued, her voice gaining strength from the chaos she was creating. "The restaurant downtown. Richard told me to dig up dirt on Keisha's father. Said every judge has secrets worth exposing." Samuel Monroe's hands gripped his gavel so tight his knuckles went white. 30 years of spotless judicial service, and now this criminal was trying to paint him as corrupt. Richard's lawyer was having a complete meltdown, shuffling papers like they contained answers to prayers he'd never thought to pray. "Your Honor," he stammered, "my client had no knowledge of any recordings." "Your client," Samuel replied, his voice carrying the weight of mountains, "is about to face federal conspiracy charges if these recordings exist." That's when Keisha stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife through silk. "Play them." Everyone turned to stare at the pregnant woman who just called the bluff of a desperate criminal. "Excuse me." Vanessa's voice faltered through the speaker. "Play the recordings," Keisha repeated, louder this time. "Right here, right now. Let everyone hear exactly what kind of man I married and what kind of woman tried to destroy me. What would you do if someone threatened you with evidence that might destroy your family? Would you run or stand and fight?" Share your courage stories below. Samuel looked at his daughter with pride that radiated from every pore. This was the woman he'd raised. Fearless, brilliant, unbreakable. MS. Vanessa, Samuel spoke into the phone. If you have evidence relevant to these proceedings, present it now or withdraw your claims. Silence stretched across the phone line like a wire about to snap. The recordings are in my apartment. Under FBI investigation now. They'll be released. There are no recordings, Keisha said calmly, and everyone in the room knew she was right. The bluff had been called. The desperate gambit had failed. But Richard was falling apart anyway, the weight of his exposed life crushing him like debris from a collapsed building. His phone hadn't stopped ringing. Board members, investors, reporters, federal investigators. The SEC wants to interview you tomorrow, his lawyer whispered urgently. The FBI is opening an investigation into the pension fund. Stock prices are in free fall. Richard looked around the courtroom that had become his public execution chamber. Cameras captured every moment of his humiliation. Social media dissected every expression on his face. But when his eyes landed on Keisha, 7 months pregnant, standing strong despite everything he'd put her through, something cracked inside his chest. "I'm sorry." The words came out so quietly that the court reporter had to ask him to repeat them. "I said I'm sorry." Louder now, his voice carrying across the marble and mahogany. "To Keisha, to our son, to everyone I've hurt building this empire of lies." The courtroom fell silent, except for the clicking of camera shutters and the scratching of pens on paper. Keisha stared at her ex-husband, searching his face for traces of the man she'd once loved. Was this genuine remorse or another manipulation? Richard stood up slowly, his expensive suit wrinkled, his perfect hair disheveled. "I abandoned my pregnant wife because I was too proud to admit I was scared. Scared of being a father. Scared of being responsible for someone else's happiness." His voice grew stronger with each confession. "I let Vanessa attack you because it was easier than facing what I'd become. I questioned my own son's paternity because believing lies was simpler than accepting truth." Have you ever watched someone's soul break open in public? When someone finally tells the truth after years of lies. Share what that looked like. Samuel watched his daughter's face carefully. Keisha's eyes held tears, but also something harder to read. Forgiveness? Or just exhaustion from carrying so much pain alone? The company, the money, the reputation, none of it matters if I can't look my son in the eye someday and tell him his father was a good man. Richard pulled out his phone and did something that shocked everyone in the room. He called his company's board of directors, right there in open court. "This is Richard Langston. I'm resigning effective immediately. Full disclosure of all financial irregularities will be released within 24 hours. The phone call lasted 2 minutes. When he hung up, Richard had voluntarily destroyed everything he'd spent his life building. "Keisha," he said, turning to face her completely. "I don't deserve forgiveness. I don't deserve a relationship with our son. But I'm asking anyway." Before Keisha could answer, her face went white as paper. She doubled over, one hand gripping the courtroom rail, the other wrapped around her belly. "The baby," she gasped. "Something's wrong. Because sometimes redemption comes too late, and sometimes the most important moments happen when you're least prepared for them. When cornered animals get desperate, they bare their teeth, and Vanessa was about to bite back." The ambulance sirens wailed through downtown Atlanta as paramedics wheeled Keisha out of the courthouse on a stretcher. Her face was pale but determined, one hand gripping her father's fingers, the other pressed against her belly where contractions were coming too fast, too early. "It's too soon," she whispered to Samuel as reporters pushed against police barriers, cameras flashing like lightning storms. 8 weeks too soon. Richard ran alongside the stretcher, his expensive shoes slipping on the marble courthouse steps. For the first time in years, money couldn't fix what was broken. "Is she going to be okay?" he asked the paramedic, a woman with kind eyes and steady hands. "Stress can trigger early labor," the paramedic replied, checking Keisha's vital signs. "We need to get her to the hospital immediately." The courthouse door slammed shut behind them, but inside, chaos was just beginning. Have you ever watched someone's world fall apart and felt both satisfaction and pity at the same time? Tell me about that complicated feeling. Judge Samuel Monroe stood alone in his courtroom. 30 years of judicial experience warring with 8 years of fatherly regret. His daughter was fighting for her life and his grandson's life while the media circus outside grew louder by the minute. That's when his phone rang with the call that would change everything again. Judge Monroe, this is Detective Maria Santos, Atlanta PD. We have a situation with a Vasquez woman. Samuel's blood ran cold. What kind of situation? She's demanding to make a deal. Claims she has information about a murder. The word murder echoed through the empty courtroom like a gunshot. What murder, detective? Your daughter's first husband. Samuel Monroe had presided over thousands of cases, heard every kind of criminal confession, witnessed every type of human evil. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. Detective, Keisha was never married before Richard Langston. That's what we thought too, Judge. Until an hour ago. The phone line crackled with tension as Detective Santos continued. Marcus Williams, age 26, found dead in his Houston apartment 3 years ago. Apparent suicide, but Vanessa Vasquez claims it was murder and she has evidence. Samuel sank into his chair, the weight of revelation crushing his chest. What does this have to do with my daughter? Vanessa claims Keisha hired her to kill Marcus Williams because he was blackmailing her about something. Says she has bank records, text messages, the whole conspiracy. The courtroom spun around Samuel like he was caught in a tornado. His daughter, the woman he'd raised to value truth and justice above everything else, accused of murder by a desperate criminal facing prison time. What would you do if someone accused your child of the worst possible crime just to save themselves? How far would you go to protect your family? At Atlanta General Hospital, Keisha lay in the emergency room, monitors beeping steadily as doctors worked to stop her premature labor. Richard sat in the waiting room, his phone buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, investigators, and board members. But all he could think about was the woman fighting for their son's life 3 rooms away. Mr. Langston? A nurse appeared at his elbow. MS. Monroe is asking for you. Richard followed the nurse through sterile hallways that smelled like antiseptic and fear. When he entered Keisha's room, she looked smaller than he'd ever seen her, dwarfed by machines and medical equipment. The contractions stopped, she said without preamble, her voice weak but steady. The baby's okay. Relief flooded Richard's chest like warm water. And you? I am tired, Richard. Tired of fighting, tired of secrets, tired of carrying everything alone. That's when Richard's phone rang with a call that shattered what was left of his world. Richard, it's your lawyer. We have a serious problem. Even through the speaker, they could hear the panic in the man's voice. Vanessa is claiming Keisha murdered someone named Marcus Williams in Houston 3 years ago. She says she has proof. Keisha's face went white as hospital sheets. Not from guilt, but from recognition. Marcus Williams, she whispered, and Richard saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. Real, bone-deep terror. You know that name, Richard said, and it wasn't a question. Keisha closed her eyes, her hand moving protectively over her belly. Marcus was my first love, high school sweetheart. We were engaged before I met you. The room felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out through the vents. He died by suicide 3 years ago. Keisha continued, tears streaming down her cheeks. Depression, financial problems, addiction. I went to his funeral. Richard. I mourned him. But why would Vanessa? Because Marcus called me the week before he died, Keisha whispered. Drunk, desperate, threatening to tell you about our past relationship if I didn't give him money. Richard stared at his ex-wife, pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place. I hung up on him, Keisha said, her voice breaking. I was angry that he was trying to blackmail me. I never spoke to him again. When he died, I thought, I wonder if I could have saved him by just listening. The guilt in her voice was raw, honest, devastating. Vanessa must have found phone records, maybe even recorded conversations, Richard realized. She's twisting grief and regret into evidence of murder. Do you believe someone can be innocent of a crime, but guilty of not caring enough? Share your thoughts about moral responsibility versus legal guilt. That's when the door opened and Detective Santos walked in, her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Ms. Monroe, I need to ask you some questions about Marcus Williams. Because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, and sometimes desperate people will use your deepest regrets as weapons against your future. They came for a custody hearing and witnessed the fall of an empire. Detective Maria Santos pulled up a chair beside Keisha's hospital bed, her notebook already open, pen ready to record what could either be a confession or the exposure of another of Vanessa's lies. Ms. Monroe, I need you to tell me everything about your relationship with Marcus Williams. Keisha's hand found Richard's, a gesture that surprised them both. After everything they'd been through, after all the betrayals and accusations, she still reached for him in her moment of greatest vulnerability. Marcus and I dated in high school, Keisha began, her voice steady despite the machines beeping around her. We were engaged for 6 months after graduation, but we wanted different things. He wanted to stay in Houston, work construction like his father. I wanted college, career, something bigger. Detective Santos scribbled notes, her expression neutral but attentive. We broke up when I was 19. No drama, no hard feelings. Just 2 kids growing in different directions. Richard squeezed her hand, offering silent support. Strange how crisis could strip away years of resentment in minutes. When did you see him again? Never, Keisha replied immediately. We talked on the phone maybe 3 times in 8 years. Holiday calls, checking in. The last conversation was the week before he died. That's when Detective Santos pulled out her phone, showing Keisha a screenshot of text messages. These are from Marcus Williams' phone. Messages to a number registered to Keisha Langston. Keisha studied the screen, her face growing confused. Detective, I never changed my name back after the divorce. I'm still Keisha Monroe, and this isn't my phone number. Have you ever been framed for something you didn't do? That moment when you realize someone has been using your identity? Share your story below. Richard leaned over to look at the messages. His tech background made him notice details others might miss. Detective, look at the phone model metadata. These texts were sent from an iPhone 12. Keisha uses an iPhone 8 that's 3 years old. Detective Santos raised an eyebrow. How would you know that? Because I bought it for her birthday 3 years ago, right before our marriage fell apart. It was the last gift she accepted from me. The pieces were clicking into place like a combination lock opening. Vanessa hadn't just stolen identities. She'd created fake digital evidence to support her lies. There's something else, Detective Santos said, pulling out another document. Bank records showing payments from an account in Keisha's name to Marcus Williams. 5 payments, $1,000 each, in the month before his death. Keisha's eyes went wide. That's impossible. I was barely keeping my lights on 3 years ago. I didn't have $5,000 total, let alone $5,000 to give away. Richard's mind was racing through possibilities, his tech genius brain analyzing the problem like a complex algorithm. Detective, can you check when that bank account was opened? Santos scrolled through her files. March 15th, 3 years ago, Houston National Bank. I was in Atlanta that entire month, Keisha said firmly. Working at Morrison Marketing, living in my studio apartment on Peachtree Street. I never even visited Houston that year. Richard pulled out his phone, fingers flying across the screen. Detective, what's the account holder's middle initial? Keisha Monroe. Keisha shook her head. My middle name is Marie. Always has been. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Vanessa hadn't just lied about the evidence. She manufactured it completely, creating fake bank accounts, stolen phone numbers, digital identities designed to frame an innocent woman. What would you do if you discovered someone had created an entire fake life in your name? Comment below about identity theft experiences. Detective Santos was already making phone calls, requesting forensic analysis of the digital evidence, bank surveillance footage, anything that could prove the fraud. Ms. Monroe, I believe you're telling the truth, she said, closing her notebook. But I need to ask, why would Vanessa go to these lengths to frame you? Before Keisha could answer, The hospital room door burst open. Judge Samuel Monroe stood there, still in his judicial robes, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Because she thought she could destroy my family to save herself," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Behind him walked FBI agent Patricia Coleman, her badge visible on her belt, carrying a laptop that would change everything. "Your Honor, Ms. Monroe, Mr. Langston." Agent Coleman nodded to each of them. "We've been monitoring Vanessa Vasquez for 6 months as part of a federal investigation into identity theft and fraud." She opened her laptop, revealing surveillance footage from the Houston bank where the fake account had been opened. March 15th, 3 years ago, 2:17 p.m. The video showed a woman with brown hair, wearing oversized sunglasses and a baseball cap, presenting identification at the bank counter. When she turned toward the camera, removing her sunglasses for the security verification, Vanessa's face was clearly visible. "She's been running this scam across 5 states. Agent Coleman continued, "Targeting wealthy men going through divorces, creating fake evidence to destroy their ex-wife's credibility, then positioning herself as the sympathetic new partner." Richard stared at the screen in horror. "How many women has she done this to?" 12 that we know of. "You were number 13, Mr. Langston." The room spun around Richard as he realized the depth of his blindness. Not just blind to Vanessa's lies, but blind to his own wife's truth. He'd been so ready to believe the worst about Keisha that he'd never questioned the best about Vanessa. "Where is she now?" Samuel asked. "Federal custody," Agent Coleman replied. "She's looking at 20 years minimum. Wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, perjury. The list goes on. Have you ever realized you've been completely manipulated by someone you trusted? That feeling when you see how blind you were? Share that moment of awful clarity." Keisha closed her eyes, relief flooding her body so completely that the monitors beeped with changes in her heart rate and blood pressure. "It's over," she whispered. But as Vanessa was escorted out of the federal courthouse in handcuffs, screaming denials and threats, she shouted one final accusation that made everyone freeze, especially the reporters who caught every word on camera. "Ask them about the life insurance policy. Ask them who benefits when Marcus Williams dies." Because sometimes, even when you think you've won, the game isn't over. And sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones mixed with just enough truth to plant seeds of doubt that grow in the dark. Sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones wrapped in truth. The federal courthouse steps became a war zone as Vanessa's final words echoed through every camera and microphone in Atlanta. Life insurance, beneficiary, Marcus Williams. 3 words that could destroy Keisha's vindication and turn her from victim back to suspect. FBI agent Coleman's face went grim as she watched the media frenzy explode in real time. Social media hashtags shifted from hashtag justice for Keisha to hashtag life insurance scandal within minutes. "We need to get back to the hospital," she told Judge Monroe. "Now." Richard helped Keisha into the wheelchair, his hands shaking as photographers pushed against police barriers, shouting questions about insurance policies and suspicious deaths. "Did you kill Marcus Williams for money? How much was the policy worth? Were you planning this for years? Have you ever watched the media tear apart someone's reputation based on nothing but speculation?" Comment below about trial by social media versus trial by facts. Back in Keisha's hospital room, Agent Coleman opened her laptop with the expression of someone about to defuse a bomb. The screen displayed insurance documents that made everyone's blood run cold. Marcus Williams had a life insurance policy through his construction company. She began, her voice clinical and precise. $50,000 death benefit. Richard felt his stomach drop. Who was the beneficiary? Agent Coleman scrolled down to the highlighted section. Keisha Marie Monroe. The silence in the room was deafening except for the steady beep of medical monitors and the distant sound of helicopters circling overhead. Keisha stared at the document like it was written in a foreign language. Marcus never told me. I had no idea." According to the insurance company records, Agent Coleman continued. "You were listed as beneficiary in 2018, 2 years before his death. The policy was never changed. Samuel Monroe's judicial mind was working through implications like a chess master calculating moves. Agent Coleman, who has access to employee insurance records, HR departments, insurance agents, sometimes company executives. She paused meaningfully, and people who know how to hack into computer systems. Richard's tech background kicked into high gear. Vanessa worked in corporate administration before she became my assistant. She would have had access to employee databases, insurance systems, payroll records. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they created was more complex than simple fraud. Agent Coleman, Keisha said quietly, "I need to tell you something about that insurance policy." Everyone in the room held their breath. When Marcus and I were engaged, we took out life insurance policies on each other. $25,000 each, just basic coverage. Young couple planning for the future. Her voice grew stronger as memory returned. When we broke up, we were supposed to change the beneficiaries. I changed mine immediately, but he didn't change his, Samuel realized. Marcus was forgetful about paperwork, Keisha admitted. Bills, forms, anything administrative. It drove me crazy when we were together. Agent Coleman was already making phone calls, requesting the original policy documents, application dates, any correspondence about beneficiary changes. Ms. Monroe, did you ever receive notification about being a beneficiary? Never. No letters, no calls, nothing. When Marcus died, his family handled everything. I went to the funeral, paid my respects, but there was never any mention of insurance or money. What would you do if you discovered you were entitled to money from someone's death, but had no idea? Would you keep it or give it away? Share your moral dilemma stories. Richard was pacing the small hospital room, his business mind analyzing angles. If Vanessa knew about this policy, she could have planned her entire frame-up around it. Make it look like Keisha had motive for murder. But how would she know Marcus was going to die? Samuel asked. That's when Agent Coleman's phone rang with information that changed everything again. Agent Coleman here. She listened for several minutes, her expression growing darker. Are you certain? Okay, send me the reports immediately. When she hung up, her face was pale. Marcus Williams' autopsy has been reopened. The Houston Medical Examiner found inconsistencies in the original suicide ruling. The room felt like all the air had been sucked out through the vents. What kind of inconsistencies? Richard asked. The angle of the gunshot wound doesn't match self-infliction. There were no fingerprints on the weapon except his. And Agent Coleman hesitated. Traces of a sedative in his blood that wasn't prescribed to him. Keisha's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God, she actually killed him. The horrible truth was taking shape like a photograph developing in dark chemicals. Vanessa hadn't just framed Keisha for murder. She'd committed murder to create the frame. Agent Coleman, Samuel said carefully, how long has Vanessa been in Atlanta? She arrived 18 months ago, right after Marcus Williams' death was ruled suicide and the insurance payout was processed. Richard stopped pacing, his face going white. The payout. If Keisha was the beneficiary, the $50,000 was deposited into a bank account registered to Keisha R. Monroe, Agent Coleman confirmed. The same fake account we discovered earlier. The plan was diabolical in its completeness. Murder Marcus Williams. Frame Keisha as the killer. Steal the insurance money. Move to Atlanta. Target Richard Langston. Destroy his marriage from the inside. Have you ever realized that someone's entire relationship with you was part of an elaborate criminal plan? Comment below about deception and manipulation in your life. How did she even know about me and Richard? Keisha asked, the question that had been haunting her. Agent Coleman pulled out another file. Vanessa researched wealthy divorced men across the South. Your divorce was public record. Your maiden name, your background, your father's position as a judge. She saw an opportunity and spent months planning. The hospital room door opened and Detective Santos appeared with news that would close the case forever. We found Marcus Williams' phone, she announced, holding up an evidence bag. It was hidden in Vanessa's apartment. Still has her fingerprints on it, and text messages she sent to herself using his number. The digital evidence, the fake bank accounts, the manufactured conspiracy, all of it created by a woman who'd murdered an innocent man just to steal money and destroy lives. It's over, Agent Coleman said, closing her laptop. Vanessa Vasquez is going to prison for the rest of her life. But as they celebrated the truth finally coming to light, none of them noticed the news van pulling up outside the hospital or the reporter who'd been listening to police scanners. Because sometimes justice wins, but the media circus never really ends. Some truths set you free. Others chain you to consequences you never imagined. The DNA results envelope sat unopened on the hospital bedside table for 3 hours while Atlanta held its breath. Every news channel, every social media platform, every coffee shop conversation centered on one question. Was Richard Langston really the father of Keisha Monroe's baby? Even though Vanessa's lies had been exposed, even though the murder frame-up had crumbled, this one test would determine whether a family could heal or whether the damage was permanent. Richard stared at the envelope like it contained a bomb instead of biological evidence. What if? He started then stopped. What if what? Keisha asked gently, her hand resting on her belly where their son kicked restlessly. What if I've been such a terrible person that I don't deserve to be his father, regardless of DNA? Judge Samuel Monroe looked up from legal documents he'd been reviewing. Son, DNA makes you a biological parent. Character makes you a father. Which one do you want to be? The question hung in the hospital room like incense, heavy and meaningful. Have you ever had a moment where you could choose who you wanted to become, regardless of who you'd been before? Share that turning point in your life. Richard picked up the envelope with hands that shook like autumn leaves. The paper felt heavier than corporate contracts worth millions of dollars. Keisha, before I open this, I need you to know something. His voice carried the weight of genuine remorse. Even if this baby isn't mine biologically, I want to be part of his life. I want to be the father I never had, the husband I never was to you. Keisha's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of possibility, of second chances, of hope she'd thought was dead. Open it, she whispered. Richard tore open the envelope, unfolded the official laboratory letterhead, and read the results that would change 3 lives forever. His face went through a series of expressions: fear, relief, joy, overwhelming emotion. He looked up at Keisha with eyes that were completely different from the cold businessman who'd sat in that courtroom days ago. 99.7% probability, he said, his voice breaking. I'm his father. The room erupted in celebration that was both quiet and profound. Samuel Monroe hugged his daughter. Richard put his hand on Keisha's belly, feeling his son move beneath his palm for the first time with absolute certainty. Hello, little man, Richard whispered to the baby. Daddy's here, and he's not going anywhere ever again. But the moment of family healing was interrupted by shouting from a hospital corridor. Reporters had somehow gotten past security, and their voices carried through the walls. Is it true Richard Langston is donating his entire fortune to charity? Will he face criminal charges for the pension fund scandal? What's the custody arrangement going to be? Have you ever had private family moments invaded by public attention? Comment below about privacy in the social media age. Agent Coleman appeared in the doorway, her expression mixing professional duty with personal concern. I hate to interrupt, but we need to discuss Richard's legal situation. The celebration stopped like someone had turned off music mid-song. The SEC investigation, the pension fund, the corporate fraud. These charges aren't going away just because Vanessa's been exposed as a criminal. Richard nodded slowly. He'd known this moment was coming. What am I looking at? Best case scenario with full cooperation and restitution, 2 to 3 years federal prison. Worst case, 15 to 20. The words hit the hospital room like physical blows. Keisha's hand tightened around Richard's fingers. I'll cooperate completely, Richard said without hesitation. Every document, every transaction, every detail. My employee's pension fund will be restored in full, plus interest. That's going to cost you everything, Agent Coleman warned. Your company, your personal assets, your entire fortune. Richard looked at Keisha, then at his father-in-law, Then at the ultrasound picture taped to the hospital bed rail, showing his son's tiny profile. "I spent 34 years building an empire of money and lies," he said quietly. "I'd rather spend the rest of my life building something real." Samuel Monroe felt pride swell in his chest, not for the successful businessman, but for the man who was choosing integrity over wealth. "Agent Coleman, what if Mr. Langston agreed to testify against other corporate executives involved in similar schemes?" Agent Coleman's eyebrows rose. "You know about other cases?" "I know about 12 companies using identical pension fund strategies. Same accounting firm, same offshore structures, same victims." Richard's tech background had given him access to information most people never saw. "I can provide evidence that will help hundreds of families recover stolen retirement money." The agent was already calculating the impact. 12 companies, thousands of employees, millions of dollars in stolen benefits. That level of cooperation could reduce your sentence significantly. Maybe 18 months with good behavior. 18 months. Richard could live with 18 months if it meant coming home to his son and maybe, possibly, earning forgiveness from the woman he'd failed so completely. Do you believe people can truly change, or do they just get better at hiding who they really are? Share your thoughts about redemption and second chances. Keisha spoke for the first time in 20 minutes. "I want him in our son's life. But I need to know this change is real, not just another performance to get what he wants." Richard met her eyes with honesty that had been missing from their entire marriage. "Give me 18 months to prove it. If I come out of prison the same selfish man who went in, you'll know. If I come out different." He paused. "Maybe we can build something neither of us thought was possible." The hospital room fell quiet except for the steady beep of monitors and the distant sound of Atlanta traffic. 3 adults contemplating futures they'd never imagined, bound together by a tiny person who would be born into a world completely different from the one his parents had created through lies and betrayal. But outside the hospital window, Richard's phone was buzzing with a call that would test every promise he'd just made. Because transformation is easy to promise in a moment of crisis. Living up to those promises when the world is watching is the real test of character. Redemption doesn't erase the past. It just gives you permission to build a better future. The phone call that changed everything came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the DNA results confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. Richard answered on the second ring, his voice hoarse from sleepless nights spent staring at ultrasound photos and court documents. "Mr. Langston, this is James Morrison from Morrison Marketing." Richard's blood went cold. Morrison Marketing was where Keisha had worked during their marriage, the job she'd loved until his demands and jealousy forced her to quit. "We've been following the news coverage," Morrison continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to deliver life-changing information. "We want to offer Keisha her old position back. Full benefits, salary increase, and flexible schedule for when the baby comes." The offer should have been good news, but Richard heard the subtext loud and clear. They wanted Keisha back. They didn't mention him at all. Have you ever realized that your actions didn't just hurt your family, but destroyed opportunities for people you claim to love? Share your regret stories below. Richard walked to the hospital window where Keisha was finally getting some rest after days of stress and early contractions. Her face was peaceful in sleep, one hand curved protectively over their son. At the courthouse, Judge Samuel Monroe was dealing with his own reckoning. The Judicial Ethics Committee had called an emergency meeting to discuss his handling of his daughter's case. "Judge Monroe," the committee chair began, shuffling papers with obvious discomfort. "While we understand your personal investment in this case, presiding over your own daughter's custody hearing raises serious ethical concerns." Samuel had expected this conversation from the moment he'd revealed his relationship to Keisha in open court. 30 years of spotless service, and now his career hung in the balance because he'd chosen to protect his family. "I understand the committee's position," Samuel replied with a dignity that had defined his entire career. "I should have recused myself immediately. The question is whether your rulings were influenced by paternal bias rather than legal precedent." Samuel considered the question with the same careful deliberation he'd applied to thousands of cases. Committee members, every piece of evidence against Richard Langston was independently verified by federal investigators. Every charge against Vanessa Vasquez was corroborated by multiple law enforcement agencies. My relationship to one party didn't change the facts. The committee members exchanged glances. The case had become a media sensation, but not because of judicial misconduct. It was famous because justice had actually been served. Judge Monroe, the public response has been overwhelmingly positive, the chair admitted. 12,000 letters of support. A petition with 50,000 signatures asking us to commend your handling of the case. Samuel raised an eyebrows. He'd been so focused on ethics and family that he'd ignored public opinion entirely. What would you do if you had to choose between following rules and protecting your family? Comment below about times when doing the right thing felt wrong. Back at the hospital, Richard was having the hardest conversation of his life. Not with lawyers or investigators, but with a woman he'd spent 5 years failing to understand. "I want you to take the job at Morrison," he said, sitting beside Keisha's bed. She looked at him with surprise and suspicion. "Why? Because you love that job. Because you were brilliant at it. Because I took it away from you with my jealousy and control, and now I can give it back." Keisha studied his face, looking for traces of manipulation or hidden agendas. She'd been married to Richard long enough to recognize his tactics. "What's the catch, Richard? What do you want in return?" "Nothing," he said, and meant it. "I want you to have everything I cost you. Career, independence, financial security. Our son deserves a mother who's fulfilled, not trapped." The words hung between them like a bridge neither of them was sure they could cross. "You're going to prison," Keisha said gently. "For at least 18 months, maybe longer. I need to be able to support our son alone." Richard nodded. "I know, and I need to know that you're both taken care of while I'm gone. Not because you depend on me, but because you're strong enough to thrive without me. Have you ever loved someone enough to want them to be happy without you? Share your stories about selfless love versus selfish need." That's when Agent Coleman appeared in the doorway with news that would change the trajectory of Richard's entire future. "Mr. Langston, I have an update on your case." Richard braced himself for bad news. In his experience, updates from federal agents were never good. "The information you provided about corporate pension fraud has led to the largest white-collar crime bust in Georgia history. 12 companies, 47 executives, over $200 million recovered for victims." Keisha sat up straighter, her hand finding Richard's automatically. "Your cooperation has been so valuable that the Justice Department is prepared to offer you a deal we've never offered before." Richard held his breath. House arrest instead of federal prison. 2 years, electronic monitoring, complete asset forfeiture except for a basic living allowance. But you stay home with your family. The offer hit Richard like lightning. House arrest meant being there when his son was born. It meant helping with midnight feedings and first steps and all the moments he'd assumed he'd miss. "There's one condition," Agent Coleman continued. "You have to testify in open court against every executive you've implicated. Your testimony will be broadcast nationally, and you'll face cross-examination from the best defense lawyers money can buy." Richard looked at Keisha, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. Public testimony meant national humiliation, but it also meant accountability. It meant facing his victims directly and helping them get justice. "I'll do it," Richard said without hesitation. Agent Coleman smiled for the first time since they'd met. "Mr. Langston, I've been investigating white-collar crime for 15 years. Most defendants try to minimize their crimes and blame others. You're the first one who's asked how he can do more to help the victims." As Agent Coleman left to prepare the paperwork, Richard and Keisha sat in silence, contemplating a future that looked nothing like either of them had imagined. "Richard," Keisha said quietly, "I need you to understand something. This doesn't mean we're getting back together. This doesn't mean everything is forgiven." Richard nodded. "I know. I'm not trying to earn forgiveness. I'm trying to earn the right to be our son's father." Outside the hospital window, Atlanta buzzed with the news that Richard Langston had chosen accountability over self-preservation. Stock markets reacted, news channels debated, and social media exploded with opinions about redemption and justice. But inside room 247, two people who'd loved each other badly were learning how to love each other well. Not as husband and wife, but as parents committed to giving their child something neither of them had experienced, a family built on truth instead of lies. The most important moments happen when the cameras aren't rolling and the crowds go home. 6 weeks later, Richard walked down the courthouse steps as a free man for the last time in 2 years. The media circus had finally died down, the reporters had moved on to other scandals, and Atlanta had returned to its normal rhythm of traffic and commerce. But for Richard Langston, nothing would ever be normal again. The electronic monitoring device around his ankle was a constant reminder of his choices and their consequences. House arrest meant freedom within limits. He could work from home, attend medical appointments, buy groceries, but every movement was tracked by GPS satellites and federal computers. Keisha waited for him at the bottom of the courthouse steps, 8 months pregnant now, glowing with the health and confidence that had returned as stress left her life. Beside her stood Judge Samuel Monroe, who'd been cleared of all ethics violations and commended for his handling of the case. "How do you feel?" Keisha asked as they walked toward the parking garage together. Richard considered the question seriously. "Lighter," he said finally, "like I've been carrying a weight for years and finally put it down." "Have you ever told the truth about something you've been hiding for years? That feeling of relief mixed with terror? Share your confession stories below." The testimony had been brutal but necessary. 6 days of cross-examination, defense lawyers trying to destroy his credibility, prosecutors walking him through every crime in excruciating detail. Richard had answered every question honestly, even when honesty made him look worse. The victims' impact statements had been the hardest part. Retired teachers who'd lost their pension funds. Construction workers whose retirement dreams had evaporated. Families forced to choose between medication and mortgage payments because their security had been stolen by men in expensive suits. "I want to do something," Richard said as they reached the car. "For the families I hurt. Something beyond just returning their money." Samuel Monroe looked at his former son-in-law with growing respect. "What did you have in mind?" "A foundation. Not charity, but investment. Small business loans for people whose retirement funds were stolen. Help them rebuild what we destroyed." Keisha raised an eyebrow. "With what money?" "You gave everything to restitution." Richard smiled. Not the calculating smirk of his corporate days, but something genuine and warm. "I may have lost my fortune, but I didn't lose my brain. I can code, design systems, build companies from nothing. I just need to do it honestly this time." They drove through Atlanta in comfortable silence, past the gleaming towers of Richard's former empire, past the courthouse where their family had almost been destroyed, toward a future none of them could have imagined 6 months ago. What would you do if you had to start over completely at 35? Comment below about second chances and new beginnings. That evening, in the small apartment Richard was renting while under house arrest, he set up a computer workstation that looked nothing like his former executive office. No mahogany desk, no floor-to-ceiling windows, no view of the city skyline. Just a folding table, a laptop, and code that could change lives instead of destroying them. Keisha arrived at 8 p.m. with takeout Chinese food and an expression Richard couldn't read. "We need to talk," she said, settling her pregnant bulk into his only comfortable chair. Richard's heart rate spiked. In his experience, "we need to talk" never led anywhere good. "I've been thinking about us," Keisha continued, her hand resting on her belly where their son kicked restlessly. "About what happens when the baby comes, about custody arrangements, about how we co-parent when we're not married anymore." Richard waited, afraid to hope, afraid to assume anything. "I want to try something," she said slowly. "Not marriage, not dating, but partnership. Real partnership, the kind we never had before." Richard's breath caught in his throat. "What does that mean?" "It means we raise our son together. We make decisions together. We support each other as parents, even if we're not together as a couple." Keisha's eyes were clear and determined. But Richard, one lie, one manipulation, one attempt to control me or our son, and it's over forever. The terms were harsh but fair. Richard had earned harsh terms through 5 years of selfish behavior. "I understand," he said. "And Keisha, thank you for giving me a chance I don't deserve." That's when Keisha's face changed, pain replacing determination as she doubled over with a contraction that took her breath away. "The baby," she gasped. "It's time." Have you ever had life-changing moments happen at the most unexpected times? Share your stories about babies who chose their own schedules. Richard called 911 while helping Keisha to the car, his hands steady despite the panic in his chest. The electronic monitoring device on his ankle would alert federal marshals that he was leaving his approved area, but some things mattered more than legal restrictions. The drive to Atlanta General Hospital took 12 minutes that felt like 12 hours. Keisha gripped Richard's hand through contractions that were coming faster and stronger with each passing minute. "What if I'm not ready?" she whispered between waves of pain. "What if I don't know how to be a mother?" Richard squeezed her hand, drawing on strength he didn't know he possessed. "You've been protecting him for 9 months already. You've been his mother since the day you found out he existed." They reached the hospital just as Keisha's water broke in the passenger seat, turning their carefully planned birth experience into an emergency rush through automatic doors and sterile hallways. In the delivery room, surrounded by nurses and monitors and medical equipment, Richard held Keisha's hand as she brought their son into the world with strength that took his breath away. Samuel Monroe arrived just as his grandson took his first breath, his cries filling the delivery room with the sound of new life and second chances. "He's perfect," Richard whispered, staring at the tiny person who just made him a father. But as he held his son for the first time, Richard whispered something to Keisha that no one else heard. Words that would define their future and prove that some people really can change. "I promise you'll never have to be strong enough for both of us again." Because sometimes the most important promises are made in delivery rooms, when new life makes everything else seem possible. Sometimes the best revenge is living well, and sometimes it's giving someone the chance to earn forgiveness. 3 months after Samuel Richard Langston entered the world at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, his parents were learning that raising a baby changes everything you thought you knew about love, exhaustion, and partnership. Richard's house arrest apartment had been transformed into something resembling a functional home. The folding table now held baby monitors alongside computer screens. The sparse bachelor space had grown soft with blankets, bottles, and the sweet chaos of new parenthood. Keisha arrived every morning at 7 a.m., her hair in a messy bun, carrying coffee and the determined expression of a woman running on 4 hours of sleep. Their custody arrangement was unconventional. She lived in her own apartment, but spent most days at Richard's place because the baby seemed to sleep better there. "He's got your stubborn streak," Richard said, bouncing Samuel against his shoulder while coffee percolated in the kitchen. "Won't sleep unless everything's exactly perfect." Keisha smiled, the first genuine smile Richard had seen from her in months. He gets that from both sides of the family. Have you ever watched someone become a completely different person when they became a parent? Share your stories about transformative love below. Richard had thrown himself into fatherhood with the same intensity he'd once applied to corporate takeovers, but gentler, more thoughtful. He'd read 17 books on child development, learned to change diapers faster than any new father had a right to, and discovered that making his son laugh was better than closing million-dollar deals. The Foundation Project had grown beyond his wildest expectations. Working from his apartment computer, Richard had designed a micro-lending platform that connected pension fraud victims with startup capital. Small amounts, $5,000, $10,000, but enough to help people rebuild businesses and dreams that corporate greed had destroyed. "We've approved 43 loans so far," Richard told Keisha as they sat on his couch, Samuel sleeping peacefully between them. "Construction company in Alabama, bakery in Tennessee, auto repair shop right here in Atlanta." Keisha studied the laptop screen showing loan applications and success stories. "This is good work, Richard. Real work that helps people instead of using them." The praise meant more to Richard than any corporate achievement ever had. Judge Samuel Monroe visited every Sunday, arriving with groceries and legal advice in equal measure. Watching his daughter and former son-in-law navigate co-parenting filled him with pride and hope he'd thought was lost forever. "You two are doing something remarkable," he said, holding his grandson while Richard prepared bottles and Keisha sorted tiny clothes. Building a family that works without forcing it to fit old definitions. What would your ideal co-parenting situation look like? Comment below about modern families and unconventional solutions. The phone call that tested everything came on a Thursday afternoon in October. Richard answered absently, his attention focused on Samuel's tummy time on the living room carpet. "Mr. Langston? This is Margaret Chun from Techstar Ventures in San Francisco." Richard's blood pressure spiked. Techstar was one of the biggest venture capital firms in the country, and they were calling a convicted felon under house arrest. "We've been following your micro-lending platform," Margaret continued. "The algorithm is extraordinary, the success rate is unprecedented, and the social impact is exactly what our investors are looking for." Richard looked at Keisha, who was listening with growing amazement. "We want to offer you $20 million in startup funding." The number hung in the air like smoke from a fire that could either warm them or burn everything down. "There's one condition," Margaret added. "You need to relocate to Silicon Valley. Full-time commitment, equity partnership, the whole package." Richard stared at his son, who was trying to grab his own feet with the determination of someone solving the world's most important puzzle. "Ms. Chun, I appreciate the offer, but I can't relocate. I'm under federal house arrest for another 18 months. Silence stretched across the phone line. "We weren't aware of your legal situation. I'm a convicted felon," Richard said clearly. "Corporate fraud, pension theft, conspiracy. I served my time with house arrest instead of prison because I cooperated with federal investigators." More silence. Then, "Mr. Langston, give me 24 hours to discuss this with our partners." When Richard hung up, Keisha was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. "You just turned down $20 million, she said slowly. Richard picked up Samuel, who gurgled happily and grabbed his father's finger with surprising strength. "I turned down $20 million that would take me away from my son," Richard corrected. "There's a difference. Have you ever chosen family over career advancement? Comment below about priorities and what really matters in life." The next morning, Margaret Chin called back with news that changed everything. "Mr. Langston, our partners want to modify the offer. We'll bring the funding to Atlanta instead of taking you to California. You can build your company from Georgia with full remote support from our team." Richard looked at Keisha, who was feeding Samuel while reviewing job applications. She decided not to return to Morrison Marketing, choosing instead to start her own consulting firm that would let her work from home. "What do you think?" he asked her. Keisha smiled at the man who was finally asking her opinion instead of making decisions for both of them. "I think," she said carefully, "that our son is going to grow up watching his parents build something meaningful together." But the phone call that came at midnight would test every promise Richard had made about putting family first. Because success brings its own temptations, and old habits die harder than people want to believe. Labor doesn't wait for convenient timing, and neither does love. The midnight phone call shattered the peaceful quiet of Richard's apartment, where he'd been working late on loan applications while Samuel slept in the crib beside his desk. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end made his blood run cold. "Richard? It's Marcus Williams' sister, Angela." Richard gripped the phone tighter, his mind racing. Marcus Williams, the man Vanessa had murdered to frame Keisha. The man whose death had started this entire nightmare. "Angela, I'm so sorry for your loss. I know what Vanessa did. That's why I'm calling," Angela interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. "The insurance money. The $50,000 that was supposed to go to Keisha, but ended up in Vanessa's fake account." Richard sat down heavily, already understanding where this conversation was heading. "The insurance company released the funds to Keisha yesterday. She's the legal beneficiary, and with Vanessa in prison, the money reverts to its rightful recipient." Have you ever been given money that felt more like a burden than a blessing? Comment below about complicated inheritances and moral dilemmas. Richard stared at Samuel sleeping peacefully in his crib, tiny fists curled against his cheeks. $50,000 would secure his son's college fund, or help Keisha start her consulting business, or fund dozens of microloans for fraud victims. But it was blood money, money that came from a man's death, even though Keisha had done nothing wrong. Angela, what do you want us to do with the money? That's not for me to decide, Angela replied. Marcus chose Keisha as his beneficiary when they were engaged. Even after they broke up, he never changed it. Maybe that means something. The line went quiet except for the sound of Atlanta traffic and Angela's quiet breathing. Richard, can I ask you something? Of course. Is Keisha happy? Really happy? Because Marcus loved her until the day he died. And if this money can help her build the life she deserves. The question hit Richard like a physical blow. Was Keisha happy? She was successful, independent, raising their son with grace and strength. But was she happy? I think she's finding happiness, Richard said honestly. It's been a long road. After Angela hung up, Richard sat in the dark apartment, watching his son sleep and thinking about love, loss, and the complicated ways the past reaches into the present. At 6 a.m., Keisha arrived with coffee and the determined expression that meant she had important news to share. I got a call from the insurance company, she said without preamble, settling Samuel into his bouncy seat while Richard poured coffee with hands that shook slightly. I heard. Angela Williams called me last night. Keisha studied Richard's face, looking for signs of the manipulation and control that had defined their marriage. She found none. What do you think I should do with the money? The question was a test, and they both knew it. The old Richard would have had opinions, schemes, ways to invest or leverage the windfall. The new Richard was learning to let Keisha make her own decisions. What do you want to do with it? Keisha smiled at the question that gave her power instead of taking it away. I want to start a scholarship fund for kids from low-income families who want to study marketing or business. The Marcus Williams Memorial Scholarship. Richard felt something shift in his chest, pride mixed with admiration for the woman who could turn tragedy into hope. That's perfect, he said simply. What would you do with unexpected money connected to someone's death? Keep it, donate it, or find a way to honor the person's memory. Share your thoughts below. They spent the morning working side by side, Richard coding loan applications while Keisha drafted scholarship criteria. Samuel alternated between sleeping and providing commentary in the form of happy gurgles and adorable yawns. At noon, Richard's phone rang with a call that would change their carefully constructed piece. Mr. Langston, this is Dr. Patricia Morrison from Atlanta General Hospital. Your father has been in a serious car accident. Richard's world tilted sideways. His father, the distant, disapproving man who'd built the Langston fortune and never let Richard forget he was supposed to inherit it responsibly. How serious? Richard managed to ask. Life-threatening. He's asking for you. Richard looked at Samuel, then at Keisha, then at the electronic monitoring device that kept him confined to a 5-mile radius around his apartment. I'll call Agent Coleman, Keisha said immediately, understanding his dilemma. Medical emergency should qualify for temporary release. But Richard shook his head. He disowned me when the fraud charges came out. Said I was an embarrassment to the family name. Why would he want to see me now? Because he's dying, Keisha said gently. And people say things they don't mean when they're scared and hurt. Have you ever had to choose between holding a grudge and showing compassion to someone who hurt you? Share your forgiveness stories below. 2 hours later, Richard walked into his father's hospital room with Agent Coleman's permission and Keisha's support. The man in the bed looked smaller than he remembered, frail, and connected to machines that beeped with mechanical precision. Richard, his father's voice was barely a whisper. I'm here, Dad. I was wrong about you, his father said, tears streaming down his cheeks. What you did, taking responsibility, helping the victims, choosing your family over money, that's the man I should have raised you to be. Richard held his father's hand as forgiveness flowed both directions, healing wounds that had festered for decades. But when his father whispered his final words, They would test everything Richard thought he understood about second chances and moral obligations. The offshore accounts in Switzerland. $7 million I hid from the prosecutors. It's yours now. Use it wisely, because sometimes the people we're trying to forgive surprise us with new reasons to question their motives. The end of one story is just the beginning of another, and sometimes the most beautiful chapters are written by forgiveness. 1 year later, Richard Langston stood in the courthouse where his life had fallen apart and been rebuilt, this time not as a defendant, but as a witness to something beautiful. Judge Samuel Monroe was retiring after 32 years on the bench, and the courthouse was packed with lawyers, families, and people whose lives had been touched by his commitment to justice. In the front row, Keisha held 15-month-old Samuel, who clapped enthusiastically at inappropriate moments and charmed everyone within a 50-foot radius. The toddler had his mother's eyes and his father's determination to explore everything within reach. Richard's house arrest had ended 3 months ago, but he'd chosen to stay in Atlanta, close to his son and the business that had grown beyond his wildest dreams. The micro-lending platform, now operated in 12 states, had funded over 300 small businesses and employed 47 people, many of them pension fraud victims who'd used their loans to start new careers. Have you ever built something that helped people instead of using them? Comment below about finding purpose through service to others. The $7 million his father had left him sat untouched in a legal trust, earning interest while lawyers and ethicists debated whether blood money could ever become clean money. Richard had proposed donating the entire amount to victims' compensation funds, but the legal process moved slowly. "Daddy," Samuel said clearly, his first recognizable word, reaching chubby arms toward Richard. The sound of his son calling him Daddy still hit Richard like lightning every time. Pure joy mixed with overwhelming responsibility and the determination to be worthy of that title. Keisha leaned over to whisper in Richard's ear. He's been practicing that word all week. I think he was saving it for today. The retirement ceremony was interrupted by a commotion at the back of the courthouse. Federal agents escorted a woman in orange prison jumpsuit and handcuffs toward the witness stand. Vanessa Vasquez looked nothing like the polished manipulator who'd tried to destroy their family. Prison had stripped away her artificial beauty, revealing the hollow desperation that had always lurked beneath the surface. "Your Honor," she addressed Judge Monroe, "I have information about additional crimes. Information that could help more victims." The courtroom held its breath. Vanessa had already been sentenced to life in prison without parole for Marcus Williams' murder. What could she possibly gain by revealing more crimes? MS. "Vasquez, you have 30 seconds to state your business," Samuel replied, his judicial demeanor unchanged despite personal history. "There are other victims. Other men I targeted before Richard Langston. Other women I framed. Other murders I committed." The words dropped into the courtroom's silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread across multiple states and dozens of families. Richard felt Keisha's hand slip into his as they realized the magnitude of what Vanessa was revealing. Not just their story, but a pattern of violence that had destroyed lives across the country. What would you do if you discovered that your personal tragedy was part of someone's larger criminal enterprise? Comment below about justice and closure. Agent Coleman, who'd become almost family over the past year, stood to address the court. "Your Honor, the FBI has been investigating Ms. Vasquez's claims. We've identified at least 6 additional homicides across 5 states, all following the same pattern. 6 more Marcus Williams. 6 more families destroyed by Vanessa's greed and manipulation. She's trying to trade information for a reduced sentence," Richard whispered to Keisha. But Judge Monroe's response surprised everyone in the courtroom. "Ms. Vasquez, your cooperation with authorities will be noted in your file. However, your sentence remains life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Justice doesn't negotiate with serial killers." Vanessa's face crumbled as she realized her final manipulation had failed. As agents led her away, she screamed one last desperate lie. Richard knew. He helped plan everything. The accusation hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds before every person in the courtroom, prosecutors, defense attorneys, FBI agents, even court reporters, started laughing. Because after a year of Richard's complete transparency, his cooperation with every investigation, his testimony against former associates, his dedication to victim compensation, the idea that he'd conspired with Vanessa was absurd. Some lies are so ridiculous they defeat themselves, Samuel observed from the bench, and the laughter continued. As the ceremony concluded and people filed out of the courthouse, the Langston Monroe family, unconventional but unbreakable, walked into the Atlanta's sunshine together. "What now?" Keisha asked, adjusting Samuel on her hip while he tried to grab every interesting object within reach. Richard looked at his son, who was babbling happily in the language only toddlers understand, then at the woman who'd given him a second chance he'd never deserved. "Now we go home," he said simply. "We raise our son. We build our businesses. We help people rebuild their lives. We prove every day that people can change." So what would you do if someone who hurt you deeply asked for a real second chance? Would you trust them with your child's future? Comment below with what you would have done in Keisha's shoes. If this story of justice, redemption, and the power of forgiveness moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life dramas that prove truth is stranger than fiction. Tell me in the comments, do you believe people can really change? And remember, sometimes the greatest victory isn't destroying your enemy, it's helping them become better. The courthouse steps where Richard had once walked in handcuffs now echoed with the sound of Samuel's laughter as his parents carried him toward a future built on truth instead of lies. Because the most powerful love doesn't rescue you from your life. It recognizes the strength that's been there all along.